Fog clung low across the Aegean waters, shrouding the silhouettes of 25 Allied vessels in the pre-dawn darkness of June 17, 1943. The convoy, loaded with vital supplies for the resistance fighters scattered across the Greek islands, moved in nervous silence toward the shadowy coastline. On the bridge of the lead destroyer HMS Javelin, a lone radio operator hunched over an antiquated transmitter, his fingers hovering with practiced precision above a brass telegraph key. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. 2 minutes until transmission window, whispered Lieutenant Commander Percival Hawthorne, glancing anxiously at his wristwatch. The radio operator, wireless telegraphy petty officer Halford Everett, nodded without looking up. His eyes, bloodshot from 4 sleepless nights, remained fixed on the equipment before him. The knuckles of his left hand whitened as he gripped the edge of the steel desk. 1 minute, Hawthorne muttered, staring through binoculars at the dark horizon, where Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes would soon appear with the rising sun. Everett took a deep breath, steadying himself. No one in the Combined Operations Command knew that this morning's transmission would rewrite naval communication protocols and save thousands of lives. The convoy would either vanish from enemy detection or be decimated within hours. Everything depended on what the 31-year-old radio specialist had privately dubbed Operation Ghost Channel, an unauthorized modification to standard Royal Navy broadcast procedure that violated every security protocol in the Allied Communication Handbook. "Now," Hawthorne commanded, Everett's finger pressed down on the key. Unlike the standard emergency alert that would announce their position to both friendly forces and the enemy, his transmission pulsed out an elaborate sequence of dots and dashes, cycling through 3 different frequencies in a pattern so precise it appeared to be random noise to anyone monitoring the airwaves. Then came the most audacious part of his plan: nothing. Absolute radio silence, but with a critical difference. The convoy disappeared not by going dark, but by hiding in plain sight, broadcasting constant static on what German intelligence had designated as dead channels, frequencies so riddled with atmospheric interference that Nazi radio operators had long ago abandoned monitoring them. What the Germans didn't know was that buried within that apparent random static was an entirely new form of naval communication. 25 Allied ships were about to vanish in the Aegean, not by becoming ghosts, but by becoming the noise itself. Halford Everett had not intended to become a hero. In the autumn of 1937, he was simply an assistant postmaster in the small village of Widrington in Northumberland, a modest man with little ambition beyond maintaining his carefully tended garden and collecting mechanical pocket watches. He had been born in 1912 to working-class parents in Newcastle upon Tyne, the youngest of 4 children and the only boy after 3 older sisters. His father worked as a coal miner, and later as a dock worker after a mining accident left him with a permanent limp. Despite financial hardships, his parents emphasized education, and young Halford displayed an unusual aptitude for mathematics and physics. At school, Halford was a quiet but diligent student, more interested in solving puzzles than playing football with the other boys. His teachers noticed his analytical mind, particularly his ability to recognize patterns where others saw only chaos. When a traveling exhibition on radio communication visited Newcastle in 1927, 15-year-old Halford was captivated by the demonstration of wireless telegraphy. Using his savings from odd jobs, he purchased components to build his own crystal radio set and soon became known in the neighborhood as the boy who could fix any radio. After finishing secondary school in 1930, Halford secured an apprenticeship at the Widrington Post Office, where he quickly proved his worth. The postmaster, impressed by his efficiency and technical knowledge, promoted him to assistant postmaster by 1935. In his free time, Halford became an avid amateur radio enthusiast, obtaining his operator's license and corresponding with other radio operators across Britain and Europe. His modest flat above the post office became cluttered with radio parts, technical journals, and logbooks filled with meticulous notes on signal propagation and atmospheric interference. What truly set Halford apart was his unusual ability to discern patterns in radio static that others dismissed as meaningless noise. While most operators filtered out atmospheric interference, Halford became fascinated by it, developing techniques to map and predict how radio waves behaved when affected by various atmospheric conditions. He maintained detailed charts of how signals degraded across different frequencies and distances, information that most considered useless, but would later prove invaluable. When war broke out in September 1939, Halford immediately volunteered for service, hoping to put his technical skills to use. The Royal Navy, recognizing his expertise, assigned him to signals training at HMS Collingwood near Portsmouth. His instructors were impressed by both his technical proficiency and innovative thinking. While other trainees focused on mastering established procedures, Halford questioned why certain protocols existed and suggested improvements that were often dismissed as unconventional. After completing his training in early 1940, Halford was assigned to HMS Manchester, a town-class light cruiser patrolling the North Sea. The ship's communication officer, Lieutenant James Witherspoon, initially viewed Halford's constant questions and suggestions with skepticism, but gradually came to appreciate the young radio operator's insights. During the Norwegian campaign, when German jamming disrupted Allied communications, Halford developed a technique to maintain contact by rapidly shifting between frequencies in a predetermined pattern, allowing messages to get through when standard methods failed. By early 1942, Halford's reputation had grown, and he was transferred to Alexandria, Egypt, to join the Mediterranean fleet. There he witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of German radio direction, finding and locating and targeting Allied convoys. For every 10 supply ships that set out for Malta or the Greek islands, typically only 3 or 4 would reach their destination. The others fell victim to Luftwaffe bombers or U-boat attacks that seemed to anticipate their movements with uncanny accuracy. It was during the long nights monitoring radio traffic in Alexandria that Halford began to develop the concept that would eventually become Operation Ghost Channel. He observed that certain frequencies, heavily distorted by atmospheric interference, were largely ignored by both Allied and Axis forces. These dead channels were considered useless for communication due to their constant static and unpredictable behavior. But Halford saw something different, not useless noise, but perfect camouflage. Working during his off-duty hours, often alone in the communications room well past midnight, Halford meticulously mapped these dead channels, charting how the interference patterns shifted throughout the day and under different weather conditions. He began to experiment with embedding coded signals within the static, signals that would be indistinguishable from random noise to anyone who didn't know exactly what to listen for. By early 1943, Halford had refined his technique and compiled extensive documentation, which he presented to his superior officers. The reception was lukewarm at best. Traditional naval communications officers, trained in conventional methods, saw Halford's approach as unnecessarily complex and unproven. The official response was a polite but firm rejection, with a suggestion that he focus on improving existing systems rather than inventing new ones. Frustrated but undeterred, Halford continued his work in secret, finding allies in a small group of like-minded signals officers who recognized the potential of his ideas. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Percival Hawthorne, an Oxford-educated physics lecturer turned naval officer who commanded HMS Javelin. Hawthorne, having lost his brother when HMS Hood was sunk in 1941, was willing to consider any innovation that might save Allied lives. In May 1943, with Axis forces still controlling much of the Aegean and Allied supply lines under constant attack, an opportunity arose. A critical convoy was being assembled to deliver supplies, weapons, and medical equipment to resistance fighters on several Greek islands. The mission was deemed essential, but extremely high risk, as previous attempts had resulted in heavy losses. Hawthorne, who had been assigned to lead the escort for this convoy, approached Halford with a proposition. They would implement the Ghost Channel protocol unofficially, without formal approval from command. If it failed, they alone would bear responsibility. If it succeeded, the results would speak for themselves. Halford agreed without hesitation. For 2 weeks they worked in absolute secrecy, modifying the radio equipment on the convoy's 25 ships and training a select group of operators in the new technique. The plan was deceptively simple. Instead of maintaining complete radio silence, the convoy would broadcast continuous static on frequencies the Germans had abandoned monitoring, with actual communications embedded within this static using a pattern only Allied operators would recognize. The key insight was that German direction-finding equipment was designed to locate the source of clear signals, not to extract messages hidden within what appeared to be atmospheric interference. By disguising their communications as natural static, the convoy could coordinate movements while remaining effectively invisible to enemy detection. As dawn broke on June 17, 1943, the convoy sailed from Alexandria, implementing Halford's Ghost Channel protocol from the moment they left port. The future of Allied naval communications in the Mediterranean hung in the balance, dependent on the unconventional vision of a former village postmaster with an obsession for patterns in noise. 4 hours into the journey, tension aboard HMS Javelin reached a breaking point. The standard procedure for such a convoy would have been to maintain strict radio silence, with communications limited to essential emergency transmissions. Instead, every ship was continuously broadcasting what appeared to be random static on frequencies designated as dead channels by both Allied and Axis forces. "Any sign of enemy activity?" Hawthorne asked, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. "Nothing confirmed, sir," replied Lieutenant Edmund Wallace, the ship's executive officer. "But we're approaching the area where the previous 3 convoys were intercepted." Halford Everett, hunched over his equipment in the communications room, was monitoring the embedded messages coming from the other ships in the convoy. Each transmission was disguised within patterns of static that mimicked natural atmospheric interference. Unintelligible noise to anyone who didn't know the precise algorithm needed to extract the actual message. "Sir," Halford called to Hawthorne, "HMS Coventry reports all clear in their sector. No sign of Luftwaffe reconnaissance." Hawthorne nodded, his face betraying a mix of hope and skepticism. "They should have found us by now," he murmured. The convoy had entered what the crew grimly called Vulture Alley, the stretch of water where German air patrols from bases in Crete and Rhodes typically spotted and shadowed Allied ships before calling in bombers or submarines. By all historical patterns, they should have been detected hours ago. As noon approached, the tension began to give way to cautious optimism. The convoy had traveled farther into the Aegean than any recent Allied formation had managed without detection. Halford's system appeared to be working. Rather than hiding by going silent, they were hiding by becoming indistinguishable from the natural background noise of the radio spectrum. "They're listening for us," Halford explained to a group of officers gathered around a map table. "But they're listening for clear signals, breaking radio silence. Their direction-finding equipment is calibrated to locate distinct transmissions against a quiet background. We're doing the opposite, transmitting continuous noise with our real messages hidden inside it." "Like hiding a whisper in a thunderstorm," Hawthorne added, beginning to understand the brilliance of the strategy. The convoy continued its journey through the afternoon, maintaining its ghost-like presence on the airwaves. By sunset, they had reached the waters north of Crete without incident. An unprecedented achievement. Ships that should have been detected, tracked, and attacked had somehow become invisible to the elaborate German air and naval surveillance network. The first real test came shortly after midnight. A German patrol boat appeared unexpectedly from behind a small island, crossing barely half a mile in front of the lead destroyer. The Allied convoy, maintaining its disciplined formation, continued on course. The German vessel showed no signs of alarm. No frantic radio transmissions to headquarters, no emergency flares. It simply continued on its patrol route, apparently oblivious to the massive Allied presence that had just sailed past. "They didn't see us?" Wallace asked incredulously. "They saw us," Hawthorne replied quietly, "but they weren't looking for us. Their headquarters hasn't alerted them, because their headquarters doesn't know we're here. Without radio confirmation of our presence, we're just shadows." By dawn on the second day, the convoy had reached its first destination, a small cove on the island of Naxos, where Greek resistance fighters waited to unload supplies. The operation proceeded efficiently, with 3 ships breaking from the main convoy to deliver their cargo while the others maintained a protective screen offshore. Throughout the resupply operation, Halford's Ghost Channel system continued to function flawlessly. The ships coordinated their movements through messages embedded in what appeared to be random static, invisible to German monitoring stations. When a reconnaissance plane did occasionally pass overhead, there were no sudden increases in clear radio traffic that would betray their position. Over the next 5 days, the convoy methodically visited 7 different islands, delivering vital supplies to resistance fighters without a single ship lost. Each successful drop-off strengthened the confidence of the convoy's commanders in Halford's unorthodox system. By the time they turned back toward Alexandria, having completed their mission, the implications were clear. They had discovered a way to move with near impunity through enemy-controlled waters. The return journey was equally uneventful, a stark contrast to the usual running battles that characterized Allied convoys in the Aegean. When they finally reached Alexandria on June 25th, the entire convoy, all 25 ships, sailed into harbor intact, an achievement that bordered on the miraculous given recent experience. News of the convoy's unprecedented success quickly reached Combined Operations Command in Cairo. Initially skeptical reports gave way to intense curiosity as senior officers struggled to understand how a convoy of that size had managed to complete its mission without losses. Lieutenant Commander Hawthorne and Halford Everett were summoned to explain. In a wood-paneled conference room at headquarters, Halford laid out the principles of the Ghost Channel system to an audience of admirals and communications experts. Using diagrams and technical specifications, he explained how they had turned conventional wisdom on its head, not by avoiding radio transmissions, but by broadcasting continuously in a way that the enemy's detection systems were blind to. The Germans have sophisticated direction-finding equipment, he explained, but it's designed to locate discrete signals, clear transmissions against background silence. By broadcasting what appears to be natural atmospheric interference across frequencies they've abandoned as useless, we created a camouflage. Our actual messages are encoded within patterns of static that mimic natural radio noise. Initial skepticism gave way to intense interest as the implications became clear. This wasn't merely a tactical innovation. It represented a potential strategic advantage that could transform naval operations throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Vice Admiral Algernon Willis, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, who had initially dismissed Halford's ideas months earlier, now leaned forward intently. "And you developed this entirely on your own initiative, Petty Officer Everett?" "Yes, sir," Halford replied, "based on observations I made while monitoring radio traffic over the past 18 months. Without authorization to modify naval communications protocols?" "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for any breach of regulations." Willis exchanged glances with the other senior officers before a slight smile crossed his face. "In this case, Petty Officer, I believe we can overlook the breach of protocol in light of the results." Within days, a team was assembled to formalize and expand Halford's system. The Ghost Channel protocol was classified at the highest level, with only a select group of officers informed of its full details. Training began immediately for radio operators who would implement the system across the Mediterranean fleet. By August 1943, Ghost Channel had been deployed for 3 more major convoy operations, each achieving similar success in evading enemy detection. German naval and air forces, increasingly frustrated by their inability to locate Allied shipping, began diverting resources to expand their surveillance, unaware that the very nature of their detection systems made them blind to the new Allied communication method. The strategic impact was profound. With supply lines to resistance fighters and isolated Allied garrisons now secured, the balance of power in the Aegean began to shift. The ability to move ships undetected allowed for surprise amphibious operations that further disrupted Axis control of the region. For Halford Everett himself, the success brought unexpected changes. Promoted to Chief Petty Officer, he was transferred to a special communications unit tasked with refining and expanding his innovation. His system, officially designated Frequency Dissolution Protocol, but still known informally as Ghost Channel among those who used it, was adapted for use in other theaters, including preparations for the Allied landings in Italy later that year. Despite the accolades from his superiors and the evident success of his creation, Halford remained characteristically modest. When asked by a fellow officer how he had conceived such an unorthodox approach, he simply replied, "I just listened to what everyone else was ignoring." By early 1944, Ghost Channel had evolved into a sophisticated system implemented across multiple Allied naval operations. The original concept had been expanded and refined, with variations adapted for different regions and conditions. In the Mediterranean alone, it was credited with saving hundreds of ships and thousands of lives, by enabling convoys to operate in contested waters with minimal losses. German naval intelligence, meanwhile, struggled to understand why their once effective surveillance system was failing. They detected fewer Allied convoys, despite intelligence suggesting increased shipping activity. Unaware of the fundamental shift in Allied communications strategy, they responded by increasing air patrols and deploying additional surface vessels, stretching their already limited resources thin. The true measure of Ghost Channel's success came during the Allied landings in southern France in August 1944. Naval support groups, using Halford's system, maintained continuous coordination while remaining effectively invisible to German monitoring stations. The resulting surprise gave the landing forces a crucial advantage in the critical early hours of the operation. For his contributions, Halford Everett was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in a private ceremony, the details of which remained classified. The citation, deliberately vague, referred only to exceptional technical innovations in naval communications that significantly reduced Allied losses at sea. After the war, Halford's work remained largely unknown to the public due to continued classification of the technical details. He returned to civilian life in 1946, declining offers to continue in naval service or join the growing electronics industry. Instead, he accepted a position as a telecommunications instructor at a technical college in Yorkshire, where he quietly trained a new generation of radio engineers. Those who worked with him during those critical wartime years never forgot the unassuming man whose unconventional thinking had changed the course of naval warfare. In the decades that followed, as electronic warfare evolved and became increasingly sophisticated, many of the core principles that Halford pioneered continued to inform military communications strategy. The true extent of Ghost Channel's impact wasn't fully acknowledged until 1977, when previously classified documents were finally made public. Military historians, reviewing these materials, were astonished to discover that what had been viewed as a fortunate period of reduced losses in the Mediterranean theater had actually been the result of a deliberate and revolutionary communications strategy developed by a former village postmaster. In October 1978, a small gathering took place at the Imperial War Museum in London, where a modest exhibition on naval communications included for the first time public recognition of Halford Everett's contribution. Among those present was Percival Hawthorne, by then a retired rear admiral, who had never forgotten the quiet radio operator whose courage and innovation had saved so many lives. The brilliance of Halford's approach, Hawthorne explained to the assembled guests, was that it challenged our most basic assumptions about how to avoid detection. For years, we believed that silence was our best protection. Halford showed us that sometimes the best way to hide is to speak constantly, but in a language only we could understand. Halford himself, by then in his late 60s and walking with the aid of a cane, seemed mildly embarrassed by the attention. When asked by a young naval cadet what advice he would give to aspiring communications specialists, he thought for a moment before replying, "Listen to the noise. Everyone else is trying to filter it out, to find the clear signal. But sometimes the noise itself is telling you something important, if you know how to listen." As the gathering concluded, Halford stood for a long moment before the display case containing one of his original modified radio sets, preserved after all these years. His reflection ghosted across the glass, superimposed over the equipment that had once helped 25 Allied ships vanish in the Aegean. Like those ships, Halford Everett had accomplished the extraordinary while remaining largely invisible to history, his greatest achievement hidden in plain sight, just as he had once hidden vital messages in apparent static. In the quiet museum hall, surrounded by the artifacts of war, An elderly man who had once rewritten the rules of naval communication placed his hand gently on the glass case. Behind him, painted on the wall, were the words he had spoken 35 years earlier when asked to explain the philosophy behind his innovation. "The enemy listens for our words. They never thought to listen for our silence within the noise." The legacy of Operation Ghost Channel extended far beyond the Aegean convoys it initially protected. The fundamental insight that security could be achieved not through absence of signal but through deliberate creation of apparent noise influenced military communications for generations. Modern spread-spectrum techniques, frequency hopping systems, and various stealth technologies all owe an intellectual debt to Halford Everett's revolutionary approach. Yet perhaps the most profound impact came not from the technology itself but from the mindset it represented. Ghost Channel demonstrated the power of inverting conventional wisdom, of seeing opportunity precisely where others saw only obstacles. It showed that sometimes the most effective innovation comes not from elaborate new technologies, but from a fundamental reconceptualization of existing resources. In 1982, 4 years after the exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, Halford Everett passed away peacefully at his modest home in Yorkshire. His obituary in the Times, while acknowledging his wartime service, could only hint at the full extent of his contribution due to certain technical details that remained classified even then. The funeral was small, attended primarily by family and former colleagues. Among the mourners was an elderly gentleman who introduced himself to Halford's niece simply as Percy, but who those familiar with naval history would have recognized as Rear Admiral Percival Hawthorne. After the service, Hawthorne lingered at the graveside, eventually placing something small and metallic on top of the casket before it was lowered into the ground, a radio operator's telegraph key polished to a high shine. As declassification of wartime records continued through the 1990s, military historians began to recognize Halford Everett's work as one of the most significant but least known communications innovations of World War II. Academic papers analyzed the technical aspects of Ghost Channel, while naval strategists studied the operation as a case study in asymmetric advantage. How a single insight, properly applied, could neutralize an enemy's apparent superiority. Perhaps the most telling testament to Halford's legacy came in 2004, when a specialized communications facility was opened at the Royal Navy's Training Centre in Hampshire. Without fanfare, the building was named Everett Hall, with a simple plaque that read, "Named in honor of Chief Petty Officer Halford Everett, whose innovative thinking saved countless lives and demonstrated that sometimes true strength lies in becoming indistinguishable from the background." Today, few people outside specialized military and technical circles know the name Halford Everett, or understand how his unconventional approach to radio communications changed the course of naval warfare in the Mediterranean. Yet, each time a modern military vessel employs sophisticated electronic countermeasures, or a satellite uses spread-spectrum techniques to secure its transmissions, they are building upon the foundation that a quiet, thoughtful radio enthusiast from Northumberland established during humanity's darkest hour. The 25 ships that vanished in the Aegean, while in plain sight of the enemy, stand as testament to the power of reimagining the possible, of seeing patterns where others saw only noise, of finding security not in silence, but in becoming the background itself. In a war often defined by overwhelming force and industrial might, Halford Everett demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a new way of thinking. Would you have broken the rules to save 25 ships and their crews? Would you have had the courage to challenge decades of established doctrine based on your personal observations and insights? Would you have risked court-martial to implement an unauthorized communications protocol that violated every security guideline in the manual? These questions echo across the decades, inviting us to consider the nature of courage, innovation, and responsibility. Halford Everett's story reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and massive battles, but also by quiet moments of insight in which individuals choose to trust their understanding even when it contradicts conventional wisdom. In the endless struggle between those who would conceal and those who would detect, between signal and noise, between visibility and invisibility, Halford's legacy offers a powerful lesson. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, speaking constantly in a language only your allies understand. And sometimes, true security comes not from building higher walls or maintaining stricter silence, but from becoming indistinguishable from the very chaos that surrounds us. Share this story so others may remember what true innovation means. Not merely creating something new, but seeing the world in a way no one else has imagined. In doing so, we honor not just Halford Everett, but all those whose unconventional thinking has protected lives and advanced human knowledge, often without recognition or acclaim. For in their quiet courage, we find the true measure of heroism, not merely facing danger, but reimagining what is possible in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.